A single father was returning home with his daughter when he saw a girl on the edge of a roof. He managed to grab her by the hand and save her from falling, but later something happened that he could never have imagined. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. Rain hammered the city as though the heavens themselves were intent on washing away every trace of life below. New York under a storm was a different place entirely, stripped of its usual glitter and arrogance, forced into gray submission beneath rolling thunderclouds. Lightning carved jagged scars across the sky, briefly illuminating the sharp silhouettes of skyscrapers that loomed like guardians over the restless streets. Cars crawled along slick avenues far below, their headlights refracted through the mist, reduced to mere pinpricks of light swallowed by fog. The storm made everything look smaller, weaker, fragile. Yet high above it all, where the concrete met the restless air, the city was almost silent. The roof of the old residential complex seemed to exist apart from the noise and chaos, a solitary plateau exposed to the elements. Nathan Reeves trudged through the storm, his steps heavy and uneven. He was 35, though the shadows beneath his eyes made him look older, and the weight of exhaustion stooped his shoulders. His coat was torn and damp, a poor shield against the relentless rain, but he clutched it tightly around the small bundle in his arms. Sophie, his 2-year-old daughter, lay against his chest, her tiny body tucked deep within the folds of the coat. She slept with the serenity of one who had not yet learned of the world's cruelties, her soft breath warm against his skin. Nathan tilted his head slightly, pressing his chin against her hair, protecting her from the wind's icy claws. His boots slapped against puddles as he made his way through the complex. Normally, he would have walked the longer route along the streets, but tonight he felt too weary to bear it. Every muscle in his body ached from the long shift at the warehouse, hauling crates until his hands were raw and his back screamed for rest. He thought of the long stairwell climb ahead and sighed. Yet when he reached the ground floor lobby, a flickering elevator light caught his eye. The building's elevator was ancient and unreliable, but it was working tonight. Nathan pressed the button and stepped inside, the dampness of his coat filling the small space with the sour smell of rain. He ascended in silence, his thoughts wandering. A year had passed since the fire, yet the memory returned unbidden every time the storm came. The crackle of flames, the choking smoke, the desperate cries, he could still hear them. Sarah's voice calling for him, then silence. It was inescapable. He shifted Sophie gently in his arms, as if reassuring himself that she was real, alive, safe. She was the reason he still stood, the reason he endured. Without her, he might have given himself to that same silence. The elevator rattled to a stop. The dim corridor stretched before him, the hum of fluorescent lights echoing off peeling paint. He moved toward the stairwell, deciding to cross the roof to save time. The door creaked open as he pushed it, and a blast of cold air slapped him in the face, bringing with it the raw scent of wet asphalt. The rooftop stretched out beneath the night sky, wide and flat, littered with puddles reflecting the fractured neon glow of the city. He adjusted Sophie's weight and stepped onto the slick surface, his head bowed against the rain. At first he thought he was alone, but then through the haze of falling water, he saw a figure at the far edge. His heart clenched, pulse spiking. A young woman stood at the parapet, barefoot, her thin dress plastered to her body by the storm. Her hair whipped about her face in wild strands, arms slightly extended as though she sought balance on the narrow ledge. She looked like a ghost conjured by the rain, pale and shimmering, but the despair in her posture was painfully human. Nathan froze, staring. For a moment he could not move, stunned by the realization of what she intended. Then instinct took over. "Hey!" His voice tore from his throat, carried away almost instantly by the wind. He adjusted Sophie closer to his chest and began to run, boots slipping on the slick concrete. His heart pounded in his ears louder than the thunder. The girl turned her head at the sound, and in that moment her foot slid. He saw her body tilt forward, arms flailing as gravity seized her. Without thinking, he lunged. The world narrowed to a single desperate motion. His fingers closed around her wrist just as she fell from the ledge. The impact nearly tore his shoulder from its socket. Pain shot through his arm as the full weight of her body yanked him forward. His knees slammed into the rough concrete, skin scraping open as he braced against the edge. Sophie jolted in his arms, startled into frightened cries, but Nathan clung to both her and the girl with everything he had. Rain blinded him, pouring into his eyes, his mouth, turning the world into a blur of water and panic. The girl screamed, dangling above the city, legs kicking violently against the void. Her free arm thrashed as if trying to fight the air itself, her voice raw with terror. Nathan gritted his teeth, every muscle trembling as his grip began to slip. Her skin was slick beneath his fingers, the rain working against him, threatening to steal her away. "Stop!" he gasped, though she could barely hear him over the storm. Each time she jerked, his hold weakened. His chest burned. His lungs fought for air. Sophie wailed, her tiny voice piercing through the chaos, and Nathan twisted his body to shield her, even as he held the stranger's life in his other hand. The girl sobbed, her words broken and frantic, confessing that she had no one, that she wanted it all to end. Nathan's voice cracked with effort as he pulled against the weight dragging her down. He spoke of loss, of the fire that had taken Sarah, of the nights he thought he would never endure. He told her that Sophie had given him reason, that sometimes the reason came later than one expected, but it always came. His words were swallowed by the storm, but something in them reached her. For a heartbeat, she went still. Through the blur of water and tears, her eyes flicked to the bundle pressed against his chest. Sophie's small, frightened face peeked out from beneath the coat. The child's gaze met hers, unguarded, pure. The girl's frantic kicking ceased, replaced by trembling. She clung weakly now, her strength fading, but her will shifting. Nathan roared with the last of his energy, dragging her upward inch by inch. His muscles screamed, his knees bled against the rough surface, but he refused to let go. Her foot scraped the parapet, then found purchase. With one final surge, he hauled her over the edge, collapsing backward onto the roof. She crumpled against him, shaking violently, sobbing into his chest as though her lungs would burst. Sophie crawled free of his coat and toddled toward the stranger, unsteady but insistent. She placed a tiny hand against the girl's arm, whispering something only a child could believe, that it would be all right. The three of them sat huddled together on the flooded rooftop, the storm raging around them, but unable to breach the fragile circle they had formed. Nathan's breath came ragged, every limb trembling from the effort, but relief seeped into his bones. The girl clutched him as though afraid the earth itself would pull her away if she let go. Time lost meaning. They remained like that, bound by exhaustion and raw emotion, until the thunder grew distant and the rain softened into drizzle. Nathan finally shifted, adjusting Sophie into his arms once more, then gently guided the girl toward the stairwell. She moved like someone half asleep, stumbling, but she followed. By the time they descended into the dim hallway, the storm had begun to pass. Nathan did not know who she was, what had driven her to that ledge, or whether she would stay in his life for more than this single night. But as he looked at her drenched figure beside him, fragile yet still breathing, he knew one truth with certainty. Something had changed on that roof, for both of them. And so began the night that neither Nathan Reeves nor the nameless girl would ever forget. The night when despair collided with determination, and a stranger's outstretched hand rewrote the course of two lives. The rain had slowed to a whisper by the time Nathan led the trembling girl into the narrow apartment of his old friend. The rooftop ordeal lingered in his muscles, each step a reminder of how close he had come to losing her, how close she had come to letting go. Sophie had fallen back into sleep, her tiny hands still clutching the edge of his coat, as though she sensed the fragility of the night and feared being left behind. The girl followed without protest, her movements heavy, mechanical, as though she were a marionette pulled reluctantly from a stage where she had meant to end her performance forever. She sank into the couch without asking, pulled the borrowed blanket around her shoulders, and stared at nothing. Nathan did not press her. He had learned long ago that silence sometimes healed better than words. The only sound in the room was the faint hum of the radiator and the slow, steady breathing of the child. When morning came, light seeped through the thin curtains, soft and pale after the storm. Nathan woke in the armchair, stiff and sore. Sophie still curled against his chest. The girl was awake already, sitting on the couch, her eyes red but no longer streaming. She seemed different in the daylight, not a phantom conjured by rain, but something more fragile and real. She drew the blanket closer around herself, then finally spoke in a voice that was hoarse but steady. Her name was Evelyn Harper. The syllables carried weight, and though Nathan did not react immediately, the recognition soon stirred. He had heard the name before. Everyone had. Harper was a dynasty in steel and concrete, the empire that had reshaped the skyline itself. Gregor Harper's name was synonymous with power, his company behind half the towers in Manhattan, and this girl sitting on the threadbare couch was his daughter. It was almost impossible to reconcile the truth with the image before him. She was barefoot, drenched only hours before, shivering under a borrowed blanket in a stranger's apartment. Yet in another life she was surrounded by glass walls and servants, the child of fortune and influence. He studied her carefully, but not with judgment, only curiosity. She did not shrink from it. Instead, she told him what her name meant to her. To others, it was wealth, luxury, status. To her, it was a burden, a prison, a constant reminder of the life she had never chosen. Her story spilled out gradually, not in the rushed panic of last night, but in the weary rhythm of someone who had carried it too long. When her mother was alive, the world had been warm, almost beautiful. Her mother had walked her across that very roof once, pointing out the horizon, saying that standing between the sky and the city was healing, that it reminded her they were small, but still free. But when her mother died in a sudden accident, the warmth disappeared. Her father turned cold, mechanical, his heart beating only in the rhythm of deals and acquisitions. For Evelyn, there was no more freedom. Every day was mapped for her business school she had not wanted. Lessons in etiquette, rehearsals for a role she loathed. He told her she must carry the Harper name like a weapon, sharpen herself into something useful, and discard the rest. The memory of art rose in her voice as she confessed it. She had loved to paint. As a child, she had filled pages with colors, portraits, wild shapes that her mother had praised as pieces of her soul. But her father dismissed it as childish distraction. Love, he said, was weakness. Dreams were indulgences. Colors had no place in legacy. So she abandoned them, burying her sketchbooks in drawers, pretending they had never existed. Yet the longing never left. It lived inside her, hidden, gnawing at the edges until the night she could bear it no longer. The final blow had come weeks earlier. Gregor Harper had announced with no warning that she would marry the son of his business partner. The union would strengthen alliances, merge assets, elevate both families into an untouchable echelon. She was only 19, barely grown, and already she was a chess piece slid across a board where she had no say. When she protested, he silenced her with a threat colder than any reprimand. Walk away and you lose everything. The money, the home, the family name. You become nothing. That night she had run, her body filled with a grief so deep it carried her to the roof, convinced that nothing could be worse than continuing to live a life that was not her own. Nathan listened in silence, his jaw tight, his hands clenched unconsciously. He had nothing to offer her in wealth or name, nothing to rival the empire from which she had fled, but he understood the sensation she described. He knew the emptiness of losing the one thing that tethered you to the world. He told her his story, not in detail, not to seek sympathy, but to share the language of loss. The fire that had consumed his wife still burned in his memory. He had run into the building, called for her until his throat bled, but the flames had devoured everything before he could reach her. For weeks afterward, he had wandered in a fog of guilt, holding an infant who did not understand that her mother was gone. He had left the fire department, given away medals that no longer meant anything, taken whatever work he could find. Life had reduced itself to survival until Sophie smiled for the first time, and in that smile he had found a reason not to collapse. The contrast between them was startling. One had been born into everything and felt it as nothing. The other had been stripped of everything and clung fiercely to what little remained. Yet in that contrast was a strange harmony. Evelyn looked at Sophie, who toddled across the floor, hair still a tangle from sleep, and something shifted in her eyes. The child did not care who Evelyn was or where she came from. She climbed into her lap without hesitation, offering a toy with innocent generosity. Evelyn stiffened, unaccustomed to such uncalculated affection, then slowly allowed herself to smile. It was small, cracked, but genuine, the first she had felt in longer than she could remember. For Nathan, it was almost unbearable to witness. To see the girl who had nearly leapt into death now holding his daughter, her eyes soft with wonder, was both terrifying and beautiful. He realized then that her survival had not been a momentary reprieve. It was a doorway into something new. She was not healed, not yet, but she had stepped onto the path. That night she stayed in the guest room of Joe, Nathan's old friend, a retired medic who had never asked for explanations. Joe gave her a dry towel and hot tea without a word, treating her not as a stranger of wealth, but as someone simply in need. The simplicity of it struck Evelyn more than any luxury ever had. She lay awake on the narrow bed, listening to the rain ease into silence, and for the first time in years she felt safe. In the days that followed, the rhythm of Nathan's life began to intertwine with hers. He woke early for shifts, carrying Sophie bundled against his chest, and Evelyn found herself helping without being asked, folding blankets, preparing simple meals, even cleaning in the quiet hours. It was all foreign to her, yet strangely satisfying. The girl who had once been paraded in silk gowns now wiped dishes and felt more alive than she ever had at a banquet. Sophie was the bridge between them. She insisted on showing Evelyn her drawings, demanded that she sit beside her at mealtime, tugged her hand whenever she wanted to play. Each moment eroded the walls Evelyn had built. The Harper name meant nothing to a child. To Sophie, she was simply Evelyn, someone warm to cling to. And in those small acts, Evelyn began to remember what it felt like to belong. Yet beneath the quiet warmth there was tension, a truth neither of them could ignore. Evelyn's world had not vanished. It loomed over her still, a looming shadow that would eventually notice her absence. For now, though, she allowed herself to breathe. She watched Nathan cradle his daughter, saw the exhaustion in his posture, but also the tenderness in his hands. And she envied the strength of that bond. It was not forged from wealth or power, but from sacrifice, from loss, from love untainted by conditions. She wanted to understand it, to be part of it. As the week passed, the storm that had threatened to destroy her began to feel like the storm that had saved her. In the cramped apartment with peeling paint and mismatched furniture, she found more humanity than she had ever known in the marble halls of her father's penthouse. And though she did not yet realize it, the threads of her life had already begun to weave themselves into Nathan's, fragile but unbreakable. When she lay awake at night, listening to the faint sound of Sophie's breathing in the next room, she thought of the roof where it all began. She thought of the void that had nearly claimed her, and of the man who had refused to let her fall. The memory no longer terrified her. Instead, it whispered a possibility she had never dared to imagine. Perhaps her life could be her own. Perhaps she could choose what came next. And as she drifted into uneasy sleep, Evelyn Harper realized that though she had been born into a world of endless wealth, it was here, among people who had nothing, that she had finally discovered the faint outline of something priceless: belonging. The days that followed settled into a fragile rhythm, as though the storm on the roof had receded into memory, leaving behind an unlikely calm. Evelyn remained with Nathan and Sophie, taking her place at the worn kitchen table in the mornings, walking with them to the small market in the afternoons, returning each evening to the narrow apartment where warmth did not come from radiators, but from presence. She had begun to laugh again, hesitantly at first, then more freely. Nathan found himself watching her sometimes, surprised at how a smile transformed her face, how it banished the shadows that had once seemed permanent. He tried not to think about how long it could last, but the thought lingered at the edge of his mind like a gathering cloud. It did not take long for the outside world to intrude. One morning, as Nathan carried Sophie down the stairs for his shift, he noticed the whispers. Neighbors leaning in doorways fell silent when he passed. Later that evening, when he returned home, Joe handed him an old newspaper, his expression heavy. There, across the front page, was a photograph taken through a telephoto lens. Evelyn on the stoop of the building, her hair tied back, Sophie clutching her hand. The headline screamed with cruel curiosity: Heiress of Harper Empire, found living with working-class, single father. The article beneath speculated shamelessly, weaving a narrative of scandal and rebellion, painting Nathan as an opportunist who had ensnared the fragile daughter of a magnate. The photograph spread quickly across websites and gossip outlets. Commentators dissected every detail: the condition of Nathan's coat, the peeling paint of the apartment building, the second-hand shoes on Sophie's feet. Each word stung with its casual cruelty, each lie a stone thrown without consequence. Nathan felt his chest tighten as he read, knowing instinctively that it would not stop there. He saw the fear flicker in Evelyn's eyes as she scanned the words, her name twisted into spectacle, her presence reduced to a commodity. He wanted to protect her, to shield her from the inevitable backlash, but he knew that was impossible. By the end of the week, the backlash had materialized in flesh and blood. Late one night, a sharp knock rattled the door. Nathan opened it to find two men in dark suits standing with impassive faces, their eyes cold. They introduced themselves as representatives of Gregor Harper and stated simply that Evelyn was to come with them. Nathan stood firm, insisting she was not a prisoner, but his protest fell on deaf ears. The men did not argue. They only repeated their orders with the kind of finality that left no room for refusal. Evelyn looked between Nathan and Sophie, her face drawn with anguish. She whispered that she would fix it, that she only needed time, then allowed herself to be led away. The door closed behind her, and the apartment seemed suddenly emptier, stripped of its fragile light. The days that followed were worse than Nathan had imagined. Articles multiplied, each more vicious than the last. Anonymous sources claimed Nathan had a history of chasing wealthy women, that he was manipulating Evelyn for financial gain. Others dug into his past, twisting the tragedy of the fire into accusation, suggesting that he had abandoned his duty as a firefighter, that his wife's death had been the result of negligence. One particularly cruel piece questioned his fitness as a father, hinting at anger issues, unstable behavior, irresponsibility. None of it was true, but the damage was real. Employers stopped calling, contractors withdrew offers, neighbors who once nodded in greeting now avoided his gaze. Sophie, too young to understand, sensed the change. She asked when Evelyn was coming back, why people looked at them differently, why her father seemed heavier with silence. Nathan had no answers that would soothe her, so he held her tighter and kept moving, taking what little work he could find. At night, when Sophie slept, he sat at the table with his head in his hands, wondering how quickly a man's life could unravel. For Evelyn, the gilded prison had closed around her once more. The penthouse was vast and cold, its windows overlooking a city she could no longer touch. Her father's presence was everywhere, in the strict routines enforced by staff, in the constant surveillance, in the sharp reprimands that echoed like commands in a boardroom. She was told that she had embarrassed the family, that she had shamed the legacy. Gregor Harper paced across marble floors, his voice dripping with scorn as he declared that her time with Nathan had been nothing more than a phase, a disgraceful rebellion. He insisted she would marry as planned, that her life was not hers to dictate. Her phone was taken, her internet access restricted. Guards stood outside her door at night. She ate meals in silence, the clatter of silverware amplified in the cavernous dining hall. Her old room, once filled with memories of her mother, was stripped of warmth, reduced to another cell in which to contain her. She tried to argue, to reason, but her father's eyes were steel, unyielding. He told her that love was weakness, that family meant obedience, that her duty outweighed her desires. Each word was another chain around her neck. But something inside her had shifted since the night on the roof. She had seen another life, however fragile, and once seen, it could not be unseen. She thought of Sophie's small hand in hers, of Nathan's tired but steady eyes, of the quiet moments in the cramped apartment that had felt more like home than the penthouse ever had. Those memories became her rebellion, her secret strength. She held them close in the nights when loneliness threatened to consume her. On the third night of her confinement, as Rain returned to the city, Evelyn made her decision. She waited until the apartment was quiet, until the guards outside her door shifted into weary silence. She gathered what little she could fit into a backpack, jeans, a sweater, a sketchbook she had hidden away years before. She slipped through the emergency stairwell, her heart hammering in her chest, each step an echo of defiance. The city's breath reached her as she emerged into the night, damp air on her skin, freedom laced with danger. She moved quickly through the streets, her hood drawn low, the storm blurring the world around her. Every shadow felt like pursuit, every siren a warning. Yet she pressed on, driven not by fear but by certainty. She had been given a second chance, and she would not let it be stolen again. When she reached Nathan's building, it was nearly dawn. Her knuckles trembled as she knocked on the familiar door, rain dripping from her hair into her eyes. The door opened slowly and Nathan stood there, weary, wary, Sophie asleep against his shoulder. He looked at her as though afraid she were a vision conjured by exhaustion. She stepped inside without hesitation, her voice firm though her body shook. She told him she had walked away from the name, the money, the prison. She had nothing left but her will, and she chose him. She chose Sophie. She chose herself. Nathan did not answer at once. He simply stepped aside, allowing her to cross the threshold. Sophie stirred, blinking sleepily, and when she saw Evelyn, she reached out a hand. Evelyn knelt and gathered the child close, burying her face in her hair. Nathan closed the door, the sound final and resolute. The storm outside raged on, but within the small apartment, there was a different kind of silence. Not the silence of despair, but the silence of beginning again. The world beyond their walls still seethed with judgment, with lies, with threats. But in that moment, they were together. And that, for the first time, felt like enough. The storm that had driven Evelyn back to Nathan's door seemed to linger over the city for days, as though the sky itself shared the unrest of their hearts. Yet inside the small apartment, something had changed. Evelyn no longer looked like a girl borrowed from another world, out of place among peeling paint and mismatched dishes. She folded herself into the life Nathan had built, awkwardly at first, then with a growing sense of belonging. She sat cross-legged on the floor to play with Sophie, helped Joe prepare simple meals when Nathan worked long shifts, and learned the quiet rituals of survival that had never been required of her before. To Nathan, her presence was both balm and burden. He had seen what her return cost her, the abandonment of wealth, of comfort, of the name that had defined her for 19 years. He knew the Harper Empire would not easily forget her defiance, that the shadow of her father still stretched long across the city. But he also saw something in her he had never seen before, a steadiness in her gaze, a decision carved into the marrow of her being. She was no longer running to escape. She was running toward a life she had chosen. Weeks later, the inevitable confrontation came. Evelyn walked into the law office where her father sat at the head of a polished table, his lawyers arrayed around him like soldiers. She wore jeans and a simple black shirt, her hair pulled back in a braid. Gone were the tailored dresses, the curated image. When she placed her signature at the bottom of the thick stack of papers, she severed herself from the trust, the inheritance, the family shares, all of it. Gregor Harper rose from his chair, fury etched into the lines of his face, but Evelyn only looked at him with calm eyes. She told him she was walking not away from something, but toward something real. When she left the building, the weight she had carried all her life seemed to fall away. In the small world she now shared with Nathan and Sophie, reality was harder than she had ever known, but it was also truer. She found work at a modest cafe in Williamsburg, an anonymous spot where no one knew her name and where customers judged her not by lineage but by the quality of her smile, the steadiness of her hands. She scrubbed counters, poured coffee, learned to manage the impatient sighs of strangers. At night she returned exhausted, smelling of espresso and cleaning supplies, but she carried herself with pride. Nathan, still burdened with construction shifts, took what hours he could spare at home, and together they found small ways to dream. Their dream was born one evening at Joe's table, with Sophie scribbling drawings in the corner. Nathan admitted that he had always imagined a place of his own, somewhere not ruled by bosses who dismissed him as easily as they hired him, somewhere he could build with his hands and claim as his own. Evelyn listened quietly, then spoke of a studio she had once imagined as a child, filled with colors and warmth, a space where people came not just for coffee, but for peace. Sophie, overhearing, chimed in with innocent certainty. She called it Second Chances. The name stuck, a seed planted in the soil of their shared hopes. They began to save little by little, each dollar set aside with the weight of sacrifice. Nathan brought home crumpled bills from long shifts. Evelyn tucked away tips from the cafe. They studied small storefronts in old neighborhoods, walking past windows plastered with "for rent" signs, dreaming of what could be. They spoke of light fixtures and menus, of colors on walls, of how to make something that would outlast the pain of their past. Slowly, painfully, the dream inched closer to reality. When the cafe finally opened, it was nothing grand, nothing that would catch the eye of glossy magazines or investors. It occupied the ground floor of a renovated brownstone near the Brooklyn Bridge. The walls were painted by Evelyn herself, splashed with soft colors that warmed the space. The counters were built from reclaimed wood Nathan had salvaged from old sites, his calloused hands carving every edge. The air carried the scent of cinnamon, coffee, and something gentler, something unspoken. People came, at first curious, then loyal. They returned not only for the food or drink, but for the atmosphere, for the intangible feeling that here one could breathe a little easier. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the city in orange and pink, a man entered quietly. He wore a gray suit, his posture dignified but heavy with age. He sat at a table in the back, unnoticed at first. Evelyn was near the window, guiding Sophie's small hands with a paintbrush, showing her how to let color glide across the page. Nathan wiped down the counter, occasionally glancing toward them, his heart swelling at the sight. The man in the gray suit watched silently, his eyes lingering on the child who leaned against Evelyn without hesitation, on the woman who had once been a pawn in his empire, but who now glowed with freedom. He felt something break open within him, a crack in the armor he had worn for decades. Before leaving, he placed a folded check into the donation jar marked "Pay What You Can Days." The only note on it read, "For your colors, H." Evelyn found it later, tears pricking her eyes, not because she needed the money, but because for the first time she knew her father had seen her. Time passed. 1 year after the night on the roof, Nathan and Evelyn stood together beneath the same sky, but now not as strangers bound by desperation. They were joined in celebration. Their wedding took place on the very rooftop where her life had nearly ended, and his had nearly broken. Fairy lights strung across the parapets glowed softly. Wildflowers lined the edges. Friends, neighbors, and a small circle of guests gathered, their faces warm with joy. Sophie, now a year older, skipped down the aisle in a white dress, carrying a bouquet almost too large for her arms. Evelyn followed, barefoot in a flowing gown, her hair loose over her shoulders, her eyes steady on Nathan. The officiant spoke, and as their hands met, he declared that where a life had almost ended, a new one began. Afterward, guests filled the cafe, laughter and music spilling into the night. Later, when the last guest had gone, Nathan and Evelyn sat outside the cafe, the Brooklyn Bridge glowing behind them, Sophie curled sleepily in Evelyn's lap. The air was cool, but the quiet between them was warm. Evelyn whispered that if he had not stopped her, she would never have seen this day. Nathan replied softly that if she had not chosen to live, neither would he. Sophie stirred, clutching a mug of cocoa in her small hands, and declared that she loved the bridge, that it should be called the Bridge of Hope. They laughed together, but beneath the laughter was belief. The cafe grew into more than a business. It became a sanctuary, a gathering place where support groups met, where strangers found comfort, where second chances were not just words painted on a sign, but something lived. Evelyn organized art circles for those who needed expression. Nathan opened the doors to anyone who needed warmth, and Sophie darted between tables in her tiny apron, her joy infectious. The legacy Evelyn had once been chained to crumbled behind her, replaced by one of her own making. On certain mornings when the light was soft and the city quiet, Evelyn would stand by the window of the cafe, her hands wrapped around a warm mug, and look toward the bridge. She remembered the rain, the wind, the despair, but she remembered too the hand that had held hers, the voice that had refused to let her fall, the child's eyes that had seen her when no one else had. And she knew then, without doubt, that she had been saved not by wealth nor by legacy, but by love freely given. The Brooklyn Bridge remained steel and stone against the sky, but for them it was no longer a symbol of endings. It was a reminder of beginnings, of the courage to hold on through the storm, of the possibility that even the most broken life could be rebuilt. It was their bridge of hope, their second chance, and as long as they breathed, they would honor it with the life they had chosen together. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Check out our other videos for more powerful stories and share this one with your friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.